It was the scream that woke the entire village, the kind of scream that chills your blood, kind that you never forget. When we found Udo's lifeless body the next morning, his eyes were wide open, staring at something none of us could see. Whatever it was, it had taken him in the dead of night. Udo was not always like this. He used to be a cheerful man, even though life was hard. He had 3 beautiful daughters and a wife, Ani, who was the light of his life. They lived in a small hut in the village, surviving day by day on the little they had. Udo worked hard, but no matter how much he tried, it was never enough. The struggle to feed his family weighed on him, but he never gave up hope. Until the day Ani fell sick. It started slowly, cough, a fever, but soon it became clear that Ani was much sicker than anyone thought. She grew weaker each day, barely able to get out of bed. Udo watched helplessly as the woman he loved more than anything in the world faded before his eyes. The village healer tried her best, but without proper medicine, there wasn't much she could do. Udo felt like he was losing his mind. How could he stand by and do nothing while Ani slipped away? But they had no money. The few coins he earned from his work were barely enough to buy food. The thought of losing Ani filled him with a fear so deep it made him desperate. Desperate enough to consider things he had never thought of before. People in the village spoke in hushed tones about Naji, the old witch doctor who lived on the outskirts of the village. They said he had powers that he could do things that no ordinary man could. But they also said that his help came at a price, one that many were not willing to pay. Udo had always dismissed these stories as just that, stories, but now with Ani's life hanging in the balance, he wasn't so sure. One night, when Ani's fever was at its worst, Udo made up his mind. He couldn't watch her suffer any longer. He had to do something, anything, to save her. So, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, he set off to find Naji. The journey to Naji's hut was long and eerie. The path was narrow, winding through dense trees that blocked out the moonlight. The air was thick and heavy, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Udo's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the old, rundown hut at the edge of the forest. The walls were made of cracked mud, and the thatched roof looked like it could collapse at any moment. A faint light flickered from inside. Taking a deep breath, Udo knocked on the door. Creaked open, and there stood Naji. The witch doctor was an old man, his skin wrinkled like dried leather, with eyes that seemed to see right through Udo. He said nothing, just looked Udo, waiting. "I need your help," Udo managed to say, his voice shaking. "My wife, she's dying, and I don't have the money to help her." Naji studied Udo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for Udo to enter. Inside, the hut was dark and filled with strange objects, herbs hanging from the ceiling, jars filled with mysterious liquids, and symbols drawn on the walls. A small fire burned in the center of the room, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Naji sat down on a low stool and gestured for Udo to do the same. "You seek wealth?" he said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. Wasn't a question. Udo nodded, barely able to meet the old man's gaze. "I need money to save my wife. I'll do anything." Naji leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Anything?" There was a pause, a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Udo swallowed hard and nodded again. "Anything." The witch doctor didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he began to explain. "I can give you wealth beyond your wildest dreams, but it comes at a price. Every 3 months, you must offer a blood sacrifice. An animal, goat, chicken, whatever you can find. And every night, from midnight to 3 a.m., you must stay awake. You fall asleep, the spirits will come for a soul. And if you do not wish to lose one of your family, you will have to give your own soul." Udo felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories about such pacts before, but never had he imagined he would be the one facing such a decision. The weight of Naji's words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. "Think carefully, Udo," Naji said, his voice low and ominous. "Once you enter this pact, there is no turning back." Udo hesitated, his mind racing. The thought of losing Ani was unbearable, but the price Naji was asking was steep, too steep. Could he really do this? Could he really make a deal with dark forces for wealth? He didn't know, but he knew one thing: he couldn't lose Ani. Not like this. I need time to think, Udo stammered, standing up. His legs felt weak and his heart was pounding in his chest. Naji nodded, his expression unreadable. Think carefully, Udo. The spirits do not take kindly to broken promises. Udo left the hut, his mind in turmoil. The path back to the village seemed even darker and more foreboding than before. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels watching his every move. The night was cold, but Udo barely noticed. All he could think about was the choice he had to make, and the consequences that would follow. As he reached his home, Udo stood outside for a long time, staring at the door. Inside, Ani lay in bed, fighting for her life. His daughters were asleep, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's heart. Udo knew that whatever decision he made would change their lives forever. But in the end, the decision was not his to make alone. The illness that gripped Ani grew stronger, and as the days passed, Udo saw the light fading from her eyes. Fear of losing her gnawed at him day and night until he could bear it no longer. With a heavy heart, Udo made his choice. He would do whatever it took to save Ani, even if it meant making a deal with the darkness. The next day, he returned to Naji's hut, ready to seal his fate. Udo stood at the edge of the village, staring at the path that led deep into the forest. His mind raced with thoughts of what he was about to do. Ani's health had taken a turn for the worse. She was barely eating, barely moving, and every breath seemed like it might be her last. The desperation clawed at Udo's chest, making it hard to breathe. He couldn't lose her, not like this, not when he had the chance to save her. But that chance came with a price. Naji, the witch doctor, was feared by everyone in the village. They said he had the power to speak to spirits, to control forces beyond this world. Udo had heard the stories, tales of men who had gone to Naji in search of wealth or revenge, only to disappear or go mad. But the promise of wealth, the promise that Ani would be well again, was too strong to resist. So, despite his fear, Udo found himself walking down that dark path, his feet crunching on the dry leaves as he went deeper into the forest. The trees loomed above him, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and every sound seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the beating of his own heart. When Udo reached Naji's hut, he hesitated. The small, round structure was almost hidden among the trees, its walls made of mud and straw, and its roof thatched with palm leaves. A thin line of smoke curled up from a hole in the roof, and the air around the hut felt colder than it should have. Udo took a deep breath and stepped inside. Naji was waiting for him. The old man sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed, his long gray beard resting on his chest. The room was dimly lit by a single oil lamp that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Dried herbs and animal bones hung from the ceiling, and the smell of incense filled the air. As Udo entered, Naji's eyes snapped open, and Udo felt a shiver run down his spine. The witch doctor's gaze was sharp, almost piercing, as if he could see straight into Udo's soul. "You have come," Naji said, his voice low and rough like the sound of stones grinding together. Udo nodded, unable to speak. His throat was dry, his hands trembling at his sides. He hadn't expected it to be this hard. "You seek wealth, do you not?" Naji continued, his eyes never leaving Udo's face. "You wish to save your wife?" "Yes," Udo finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. Naji nodded slowly, as if he had heard this request 1,000 times before. He reached behind him and pulled out a large black pot. The pot was old, its surface cracked and chipped, but it seemed to pulse with an energy that made Udo's skin crawl. "This is the pot of wealth," Naji said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "Place it in a dark corner of your home, and each night the spirits will fill it with money. But there are rules you must follow." Udo listened intently, his eyes fixed on the pot. "You must perform a blood sacrifice every 3 months to renew the covenant." Naji continued. "An animal, preferably a goat or a chicken, must be offered. And most importantly, you must stay awake between the hours of 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. During this time, the spirits will visit. If you sleep during these hours, they will take a soul from your family." Udo felt a knot form in his stomach. The thought of losing one of his daughters or Ani was unbearable. But Naji wasn't finished. "If you wish to avoid losing a loved one," the witch doctor said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you must give up your own soul. That is the price of breaking the pact." The room seemed to grow colder, and Udo felt a chill run through his body. He wanted to turn back, to run out of that hut and forget he had ever come here. But then he thought of Ani, lying in bed, her breathing shallow and her skin pale. He thought of their 3 daughters, who would be left without a mother. Couldn't walk away. "I agree," Udo said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I will do it." Naji's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in his eyes. He handed the pot to Udo, its weight heavy in his hands. "Remember," Naji warned, "do not open the pot before 3 a.m., no matter what. You do, there will be consequences." Udo nodded, clutching the pot tightly to his chest. He turned and left the hut, his heart pounding as he made his way back through the forest. The night was darker now, shadows longer, and the path seemed more twisted than before. But Udo kept walking, his mind focused on what he had to do. When he finally reached his home, the village was quiet, the only sound the distant croaking of frogs. He stepped inside, the pot still held tightly in his hands, and placed it in a dark corner of the room, just as Naji had instructed. He looked at Ani, still lying in bed, her breathing shallow but steady, and felt a surge of determination. He would stay awake. He would fulfill his end of the bargain. And when the clock struck 3 a.m., he would open the pot and save his family from the grip of poverty. But as the minutes ticked by and midnight approached, Udo couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with forces far beyond his understanding. A deal that would cost him more than he could ever imagine. Udo stared at the pot like it held the entire world inside it. Udo sat in the dark corner of his small mud brick home, his heart pounding in his chest. The pot sat before him, its black surface gleaming faintly in the dim light of the oil lamp. The witch doctor's warning echoed in his mind. "Do not open it before 3 a.m. The hours had crawled by, each minute feeling like a lifetime. He fought sleep with every fiber of his being, eyelids heavy, his mind screaming for rest. But he couldn't sleep. Not now. Not after what he had agreed to. Finally, the old clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m. Udo reached out with trembling hands and slowly lifted the lid of the pot. His breath caught in his throat. There, inside the pot, was money. More money than he had ever seen in his life. The bills were neatly stacked, crisp and new. Udo's eyes widened in disbelief. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, hard cash. Felt real. It was real. Udo's mind raced. He had never held so much money before. He had spent his entire life scraping by, doing whatever it took to provide for his family. And now, here it was, the answer to all his problems, right in front of him. But as he stared at the money, a cold fear gripped his heart. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. The witch doctor's words came back to him. "You must stay awake every night from 12 a.m. to 3 a.m., or a soul will be taken." Udo swallowed hard, realizing the true cost of what he had done. The next morning, Udo woke up to the sound of his wife Ani humming a soft tune in the kitchen. He blinked, disoriented, as the events of the previous night rushed back to him. He jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen, his heart racing. There she was, Ani, healthy and full of life, as if she had never been sick at all. Udo stared at her in shock, unable to believe his eyes. Just the night before, she had been on the brink of death, her body weak and frail. Now, she was up and about, preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. Ani turned to him and smiled. "You're up early today," she said, her voice light and cheerful. Udo forced a smile in return, but his mind was in turmoil. The money, Ani's recovery, it all felt like a dream. A dangerous, terrifying dream. But as the day went on, Udo couldn't deny the truth. The money was real, and so was Ani's recovery. Over the next few days, Udo began to experience a life he had never known before. He used the money to buy things he had only ever dreamed of. New clothes for his daughters, food in abundance, and even started building a new house for his family. The villagers watched in amazement as Udo's life transformed before their eyes. People began to talk. They wondered where the sudden wealth had come from. But Udo was careful. He kept his secret to himself, smiling politely when asked about his good fortune. "It's a blessing," he would say, offering no further explanation. But as the days turned into weeks, Udo's new life began to take its toll. The nights were long, and the strain of staying awake between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. was becoming unbearable. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, his body begging for rest. During the day, Udo was a shell of the man he used to be. His eyes were heavy with sleep, his movements slow and lethargic. He could barely stay awake, and the joy of his newfound wealth was quickly overshadowed by the burden of the pact he had made. Ani noticed the change in him. She saw how tired he was, how he avoided going to bed at night. She asked him about it, but Udo always found a way to deflect her questions. "It's just the work," he would say, forcing a smile. But deep down he knew that the truth was far more terrifying. As the days passed, Udo's fear grew. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The pact he had made was beginning to weigh heavily on his soul, and he could feel the darkness closing in around him. But there was no turning back now. He was trapped, bound by a deal he couldn't escape. And then, one night, as he sat in that dark corner once again, staring at the pot that had brought him so much wealth, Udo realized that the real cost of his pact was yet to be paid. As the days turned into weeks, Udo's wealth grew. But with every passing day, Ani noticed that her husband was becoming more and more tired. First, she thought it was just the stress of managing his newfound riches. But then she realized something odd. Udo slept all day. He would wake up late in the afternoon, long after the sun had risen, and he wouldn't go to bed until the early hours of the morning. It was as if night had become his day, and day his night. When she asked him about it, Udo would brush her off, saying he was just working on important things. But Ani wasn't convinced. She noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way he seemed to drag his feet as he walked, and how he would sometimes sit staring into space, not really seeing anything. The villagers noticed too. "Have you seen Udo lately?" They would whisper to each other at the market. "He never comes out after dark, and when you see him during the day, he looks like a ghost." It didn't take long for rumors to start spreading. Some said Udo had made a deal with spirits, that he had sold his soul for wealth. Others said he was under a curse, that his money was tainted with dark magic. No one knew for sure, but everyone had their own theory. The gossip spread quickly, and soon it reached Ani's ears. At first, she dismissed the rumors, refusing to believe that her husband would do something so foolish. But as the days passed, and Udo's behavior became more and more strange, doubt started to creep into her mind. She tried asking him again, gently probing for answers. But Udo's responses were always the same, vague and unconvincing. "Are you hiding something from me, Udo?" Ani asked one night as they lay in bed. She could hear the unease in her own voice, feel the tension between them growing. "Course not," Udo replied, but his voice was flat, lacking the warmth it used to have. Turned his back to her, ending the conversation before it could go any further. Ani lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to have. What if the rumors were true? What if Udo had done something terrible to get this money? The idea filled her with dread, but she couldn't shake it. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she didn't really know what was going on with her husband anymore. The next day, Ani decided to talk to her closest friend about her worries. Nkem was wise and always knew what to say. When Ani told her about Udo's strange behavior, Nkem listened carefully, her face serious. "Ani, you need to be careful," Nkem said finally. "Something isn't right. Udo has changed, and it's not just because of the money. You need to find out what's really going on before it's too late." Ani nodded, her heart heavy with fear. She knew Nkem was right. Something was wrong with Udo, and she needed to find out what it was. But how? How could she get her husband to open up to her, tell her the truth? That night, as she lay beside Udo, listening to the sound of his breathing, Ani made a decision. She would find out what was going on, no matter what it took. She couldn't keep living in the dark, wondering what secrets her husband was keeping from her. She had to know the truth. As she lay there, her mind racing, Ani didn't notice the faint flicker of light coming from the corner of the room, where the big pot Udo had brought home from the witch doctor sat, hidden in the shadows. But she would soon discover that the truth was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The birth of Ani's son was a moment the entire village had been waiting for. Udo had always dreamed of having a son, an heir to carry on his name. When Ani's labor began, the whole village gathered outside their home, praying, singing, and waiting for the news. Hours passed, and finally, a wail cut through the night. Cry of a newborn baby boy. Drums were beaten, people danced, and Udo was the happiest man of all. His son had arrived, and with him came hope, a new beginning. The celebration was grand. The villagers poured into Udo's compound, bringing gifts and blessings for the newborn. Udo, beaming with pride, held his son close, showing him to everyone who came by. Ani, though tired, was filled with a joy that radiated from her as she watched Udo with their son. For that night, all worries seemed to fade away. The troubles, pact, spirits, none of it mattered as Udo basked in the happiness of his growing family. But with joy comes responsibility, and Udo knew this well. The pact he had made still lingered in the back of his mind, like a dark cloud threatening to rain on his newfound happiness. He had stayed up every night since the deal, sacrificing sleep to keep the spirits at bay. The exhaustion was relentless, but the thought of losing his family drove him to keep going. Yet on this night, the joy overwhelmed him. He was pulled into the festivities, receiving well-wishers, laughing, dancing, and forgetting, just for a moment, the weight of the secret carried. As the night wore on, Udo felt the familiar pull of sleep. His eyes grew heavy, his body tired from the lack of rest and the excitement of the day. But he couldn't afford to sleep. Not now. Not ever between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. He knew the consequences, yet his body was betraying him. He tried everything to stay awake. He splashed water on his face, paced back and forth, even pinched himself, keep from dozing off. But it wasn't enough. At 2:58 a.m., just 2 minutes before the deadline, Udo's body gave in. His eyelids, heavy with exhaustion, slid shut, and he drifted into a deep sleep. As his breathing slowed, the night around him seemed to grow colder. The shadows in the room darkened, and an unsettling silence fell over the house. The spirits had been waiting, watching, and now, their moment had come. Thanks for joining us on the African Storybook channel. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Click the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story from the heart of Africa.